Welcome to The World in 30 Minutes, the podcast on the events, policies and ideas that will shape the world from the European Council on Foreign Relations. My name is Mark Leonard. I'm Director of ECFR. And this week, we're going to be talking about how MAGA, Make America Great Again, is going global. 2 weeks ago, we talked to Jeremy Shapiro about the first 100 days of Trump's second term. And today I have invited his colleague in the US program and head of ECFR's Paris office, Célia Belin, to the podcast to talk to us about what Trump means for Europe. What role does Europe play in Trump's imagination? How successful are his attempts to try to transform Europe in his image? An attempt to intimidate any transatlantic resistance into submission? And what can Europe do to defend itself? Célia has just written a very exciting new policy brief called MAGA Goes Global, Trump's Plan for Europe, which goes into all of this in a lot of details based on lots of research in the US, talking to different people and looking at what they've been writing about Europe across the MAGA ecosystem. So welcome to the podcast, Célia.
Thank you, Mark. Happy to be here.
So you've just written this policy brief where you argue that despite the constant back and forth and all the drama, the Trump administration is in fact following a plan, especially on foreign policy. From the outside, it doesn't always look that way, but can you tell us what led you to the conclusion and what the through line is beneath all of the psychodrama of the MAGA community and Trump's administration?
Thanks, Mark. Close to a decade now, Trump has been a difficult animal to get. There are several theories out there on how does he make decisions, because those decisions appear very often erratic, chaotic. They contradict themselves. He seems to be contradicting not only his advisor, but his sometimes America's interest, sometimes his own personal interest, or at least it's difficult to understand. And there's been a sort of an idea that, all of that makes no sense, that he's going to be purely transactional, that he's going to be someone that we can maybe distract and then manipulate into making such and such decision. And I ended up after a while trying to consider this hypothesis and realizing that that is not the case, actually. If you look at the way Donald Trump has been speaking about foreign policy, he has been speaking about his interaction with the rest of the world for 40 years. He's had very long-held ideas of how he perceives allies, how he perceives the execution of presidential power and presidential authority in the US. He has long believed in tariffs. All of this makes a sort of a Trumpian doctrine that I wanted to investigate. And this doctrine has a European angle that is extremely strong. It has grown over the decades of Donald Trump, including over the past decade. And so it's going into all that makes me believe today that Trump has a plan. He's always had one. And even if he sometimes reverse himself, changing course, adapts to the situation, there is a direction now that Trump is on, and that behind him, MAGA America is on too.
So what are the main pillars of this direction? Or sorry, that mixing metaphors here, but what are the main kind of elements of the Trump plan?
Well, because Trump is not your classical politicians or your classic presidential candidate or president, he doesn't do things the same way as others before him. And in one way in particular is that he doesn't apply any specific doctrine to diplomacy or to his interaction in foreign policy. On the contrary, the way he views the world, and he has been viewing the world, and the way he views the world as president is just a continuation of the way he interacts in politics. He has strong policy ideas, in particular around the ideas of authority, around the ideas of not getting ripped by others, pushing strong position in order and maximum force in order to get the best outcomes, usually financial outcomes. He has had these ideas in domestic politics as well as foreign policy. And so when we look at Trump plans and Trump plans for Europe as well, this is what has been applied, is that Trump looks at Europe through a domestic politics eye. And what does he see? Then he sees a democratic liberal Europe, Europeans that look very much like Democrats, that have been, supporters of democratic administrations, even if very often they've worked very well with Republican administrations as well. But in the particular case of Obama, these Europeans agreed with him on climate action, or in the case of Joe Biden, these Europeans agreed with him on Ukraine. And so by and large, his reading of what Europe is the extension of his political enemy at home. It's the extension of the sort of democratic opposition he's facing at home, which is why ultimately what he wants to do is to change that fact, to change either the course of Europe and the choices they make, or to oppose Europe very strongly and force them into a different position, the same way he's dealing with opposition at home.
So if we look at his view of Europe, who in Europe does he like and dislike? What role does he see the EU and different member states playing in Europe?
So I don't think Donald Trump has that many friends that he would really count on or care for ultimately. And that is true both in Europe and in America and in the rest of his life, because actually if you read his interviews from the 90s in Playboy, where he's asked about himself and his way of operating, he says that even his best friends, he's constantly testing their loyalty. And by and large, this is what he's doing in the US or with Europe. But this said, he finds some version of kinship with a few leaders, either because they have they are sharing a part of his assessment that liberal democratic ideas have been oppressive to conservative nationalist thoughts and need to be crushed, which would be a Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban type of approach, and some of the other nationalist leaders that he sometimes, says supports. Again, the support is not that strong, maybe different from the support that Elon Musk or J.D. Vance have brought to these nationalist leaders. And then he has also these long relationship with people that now he ends up knowing well. So he does genuinely kind of like Emmanuel Macron, but partly because, the French president has given him some of the respect that he seeks so much, has treat him well. But also, I think for one specific reason is that he enjoys strength for himself and in the people he deals with. And the French Fifth Republic Constitution allows Macron to concentrate a lot of the power, mostly in foreign and defense and security policy, which allows him, when he talks to Donald Trump, to just, we can negotiate, we can decide on stuff, and then he can deliver, more or less deliver, which he likes. The type of leadership he doesn't understand is the coalition leadership, is the party leadership, is the type of leadership that maybe a Germany or Brussels represents, that is, anathema to him, versus the strongman type of leadership. So those Europeans that can be looking at least like they are able to deliver in their own country are likelier to get appreciation for Trump.
So where does the European Commission fit into his worldview?
I think nowhere. He spends zero time thinking about the European Commission. He doesn't care for it. He's been saying that the European Union has been created against the United States and has been, in the past he said that it's an enemy of the US, it's a foe. Actually, he used that word, that it's worse than China, that it's been creating to rip off America. But more than, he does know that's where the capacity to negotiate on trade lies. But more than anything, he does share the perspective that other nationalist leaders or opponents have in Europe, which is that the Commission is sort of a dilution. It's where national powers gets diluted, and that he instinctively understands that this to be negative, right? That it's the wrong way to approach power would be to dilute the national power at an international level, intergovernmental, or at a European level. And so, as a matter of principle, he hates that, doesn't want to have to deal with it. He just happens to to have to, because he's focused on trade and tariffs. But if he could, refrain from it, he'd prefer that.
Where does the UK fit into this mental picture?
Well, you tell me, maybe, Mark. You'd know better.
It's interesting because on the one hand, he seems to like the royal family and want to be quite excited about coming for a state visit. They've done a sort of deal on trade. Britain is getting better treatment than most other European countries. But at the same time, that's mainly, I think, because Britain happens to not have a surplus when it comes to exports of goods to the US. So it's a lot easier to come to a deal because most of its exports to the US are services. So they don't appear in Trump's figures. But also whether part of the goal is to try and divide and rule the European countries from one another. So treating Britain better could also be a way of serving that goal.
And I would add that the UK has been clearly, for the past 3 years, on the side of Europeans, on actually the side of the West in general, in the war in Ukraine. And this very strong British voice that I think France has been seeking, especially in the past year, is also a reminder for him of this sort of alliance of purpose and values, which he wants rid of. And so maybe I'm pretty sure he's pretty happy that he was able to deliver the trade deal on UK. It's always something good to take. And as you said, he probably feels comfortable with the British society itself or the Queen. And he also has specific investments, his own golf in Scotland and things like that. But it's not as if he can count on the UK to be a full vassal to the US that would blindly follow the US's lead, or just serve his interest purely, or be purely cynical and transactional, which he appreciates from other partners. The UK, by and large, is still playing the collective European game in terms of security. He must dislike that very much.
So if we did a thought experiment and fast forwarded to the end of his term and Trump had been successful and had managed to achieve everything he wanted to towards Europe, what would the situation look like?
If he were to be successful, correct?
Yeah.
Well, fully successful, and it's not just about Trump. I want to say at this stage is that Trump 2 is not Trump 1 in the sense that he has come in with this band of loyalists, but not just loyalists, of also ideologues that believe now in the MAGA brand for itself, and sometimes more than Trump, and have developed ideas in defense policy, in foreign policy, and obviously in many domestic politics as well. And if they all are able, so Trump together with everybody else, are able to fully implement their plans, I think some of the first element is that you have an entirely different world order. You have a world order where there's no more rules-based world order, where you have big, not just sphere of influence, but almost civilization opposite each other, right? You have a strong Russian voice and a strong Chinese voice and a strong American voice, and no one can really say whether there would be a strong European voice in that world. You don't have any military commitment in themselves anymore between the US and the rest of Europe. Europe takes care of its security or does not take care of its security and care less. You'd have a transformed Europe that, if you follow that, that support for nationalist and populist, the EU itself has been transformed to the Europe of nations along the lines of the projects of some groups in the Patriots of Europe within the European Parliament, for example, all these parties that are pushing for a purely intergovernmental cooperation between these, but by and large, a lot of transactionality and a much less value-based foreign policy for Europe. And finally, I think Greenland would be American, and you'd have West really fighting hard, playing hard, and winning on some of Europe's fundamental interests, so including territory, including its regulatory environment, for example, a digital space that is fully, not only Americanized, but kind of a Wild West digitally. You'd have exchanges in crypto all over the place. So you'd have also Europe that is more transactional, more lonely, and probably with a different sort of value-based foreign policy that has disappeared, an entirely different relationship between Europe and the world.
So in your brief, you talk about these three tactics of elimination, transformation, and subjugation. So you had a bit of a framework as you were talking, like he'd try and eliminate the EU, he'd try and
Right.
transform a lot of the member states so that their politics is more MAGA aligned, and he would subjugate Denmark. Is that your basic?
Yes, because I think that's the parallel that I want to make between domestic politics and foreign policy, is that as president, he wants to eliminate all barriers to his own power. Inside, eliminate some of the bureaucracy. Outside, it's eliminating the organization and the alliances. He wants to transform the culture. He wants to transform American culture to make bigger space for nationalism and populism, same abroad and in particular in Europe. And finally, he uses this sort of strongman method to really stifle opposition and make sure you don't have dissent bothering him. When you look at the type of pressure he's exercising outside, I think he's trying to play the same game. Doesn't mean it's working as well, but you do feel, especially for Europeans that are unprepared, still a little bit unprepared for these strong methods, you do feel that you are subjected to that.
So we should talk now about what Europeans should do about it. And you've got lots of ideas in your paper about what a different approach to this different United States might look like.
Well, if we take as a premise that the objective really for the US is to get rid of its own commitments internationally, Europe needs to really think about what types of commitments it still wants to retain, not just for itself, but what type of world order it wants to build or rebuild or protect. And partially, I think we've been the inheritant of the post-Second World War world order that was America-led. If America is not leading anymore, what will Europeans do? It's not as if they can lead on their own, or it doesn't make any more geopolitical sense to do that. That maybe it's the opportunity to really reinvent the way these multilateral organizations are working, and partially and partly because anyway the trend was going in this direction, where global south and other partners' interests need to be much more taken into account, but also their own responsibility, sharing the burden now also with the rest of the world. So if it's at the moment of an eclipse of American leadership, it's for Europe to sort of reinvent what is a new 21st century multilateral organizations. Then, obviously there is also the question of protecting your own interest and sort of pushing back on the type of interferences that the US has been exercising politically. On this one, Europeans should stand firm. It is unacceptable for the United States to come and lecture Europeans on their values, on their democratic choices, on their political systems. And, after decades of America doing democracy promotion, we don't want an America that drops democracy promotion in favor of autocracy promotion. We don't want to see that, but in any way. And so Europeans need to stand very, very firm on this, including homegrown nationalist Europeans that should really see that it's not in their interest to be the vassals of Trumpism. And finally, maybe last recommendation, it's also that, if you are subject to these strong methods by the administration, you do want to make sure that you have the least of dependency. So it might be just time to de-risk from the US, partly, to make sure that you're still working and cooperating, but that on some strategic element, you make sure you are capable of sustaining some of the pressure that's being exercised on you.
So you have these three baskets of reinvent, which was what you were saying about the new institutions, multilateralism, relationships with different countries, thinking about the future of NATO, and then fighting back against attempts to transform Europe. And then finally, this idea of diversifying and thinking about how you build different kinds of relationships with different players. I mean, it all does depend on quite a lot of unity that hasn't often been there when it comes to the US. How do you think you can overcome the fact that there's still, I think, 20 countries that have so-called special relationships with the US, and that some of them all want to cut special deals with them and seem to have quite a lot of much closer interactions with the MAGA world?
I don't think it's the majority of Europeans anymore. I think we do not, we now sort of share an overall goal in the long term. The issue is more in the short term. The stress on European security, if the US were to really rock the boat on NATO or on Ukraine, is immediate, is what to do right now to sustain Ukraine, what to do right now about European defense and security. But the long view has been, I think it has, the second administration of Trump has actually clarified the first one and helped to really fully, to have the majority of Europeans fully on board with the sovereignty and strategic autonomy agenda. Even if they don't use those words, the sense of the direction is there, that it's a profound time for change. So that's really more of a short-term problem, is like, how do you tactically survive the next few years if it really is difficult, rather than, the long view of thinking that, Europe's got to change, has changed, and will continue to change. Even the Trumpist nationalist parties in Europe have also adapted themselves to this idea that they're applauding the administration, but fundamentally they're keeping to their nationalist thoughts that America first is not Europe first. It's not the same, and it's not going to replace it.
So, well, it's quite an ambitious agenda which you laid out there. I don't think we got much more time to go into the details of it, but if you had to lay out what you think the next few big challenges which Europeans are going to need to face are, where they might need to implement your framework, what are the areas that you point to?
That's a big question, but short term, you have the NATO summit coming up at the end of June, in which I think if you read into this analysis, I think we want to bring forward the idea that even if this summit goes well, the intention long term is still the same, is that, America's commitment to NATO is meant to decrease in many different ways, because either it's because of Trump's instinct or because some of his advisors really believe it's time for many of these weapon systems or these troops to just move on and go back to the homeland or go to Asia. This trend is here, and we might, in the short term, have to just fully accompany it and come back with concrete proposal on how to establish a European command, which weapons to just buy off, or how to, and maybe just embrace the reality, I would say, is one of the first step. Then the second step is obviously the trade tariffs, because they're coming back. 90 days is almost over. You'd have to, and on this one, I would recommend not so much to embrace the reality, but just to push back, fight back, and just be as tough and strong as Trump is, because this is one of the strong, and just find ways to retaliate, not excessively. You don't want to hurt yourself, but just be firm on where you're going, and no compromise on no issue linkage, and no compromise on some of the most important elements, such as, digital regulation, this kind of things you don't want to give in on. So those are the big fights for the year. I think it's largely enough. One of the ones that is more pervasive is really the cultural fight. And on this one, again, very, refusing to just play along would be my recommendations, because there is no argument to be made that the US will have any legitimacy in criticizing our judicial systems or our democratic systems. And it might mean that, the West beyond the US should lock arms and really, promote its own democratic model, firstly, and then to the world.
In the paper, you also talk, and something we talked to Jeremy about on the podcast, about the first 100 days, about some of these reviews which are coming out, like the review of America's participation in multilateral institutions, which has got the potential to be very disruptive for Europe. I think that's all we got time for today, but we do have one thing left to do on this podcast, and that is our bookshelf segment. What's on your bookshelf at the moment, Célia?
Well, I can't bring myself to read anything else than novels. So I'm reading 100 Years of Solitude. I actually just finished it by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And it's such a fantasy world, but it's also a good, it's also a good sort of fairy tale story of what happens when you're on your own, and there's a sort of a fatal destiny that is awaiting you. And so sometimes I find some kinship between the fate of Macondo in this story of Gabriel Garcia Marquez and Europe.
Fantastic. So we'll put links up to both your paper, MAGA Goes Global, Trump's Plan for Europe, on our website at ecfr.eu and in this episode's show notes. And also for people who want to read classic literature, we will take you to Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Thank you very much, Célia. It's been great talking to you. If people have enjoyed listening to us, please do subscribe to future episodes on whatever platform you've used to download this one from. And while you're there, it would be wonderful if you could give us a positive review and a 5-star rating. But for now, from Célia and myself, Mark Leonard, it's goodbye. The researcher of this podcast is Anand Sundar, and the editor of this episode is Mireia Farrow-Sarats.